Okay, it seems we are live again. Hello, everyone. We are back for our, and I cannot actually believe this, fourth installment of Angular Space Live. And well, in the previous 3 episodes, we discussed like a lot of modern stuff, a lot of futuristic topics. We did signals, we did a bunch of crazy stuff with Jerome. We talked about MCP servers and everything and Angular updates. Then we did migration to signals with Tomasz and so on. Today, I thought maybe we need to kind of, slow things a bit down and take up a bit of more timeless topic. All right. We're going to talk about Angular architecture, and we have a very special guest who will help us decipher all the things related to it. He's a Google developer expert, collaborator on the NGRX team, trainer and consultant in the Angular Architects Network, and you probably know him from NG News, his weekly Angular newsletter. You probably got a lot of information from there. So I'm very happy to welcome Rainer Hahnekamp. Hey, Rainer,
Hello.
welcome.
Hello, Armen. Hello. Nice to be here. Thanks for the introduction.
Nice to have you. Nice to have you. We're gonna have a good one. I have a very nice feeling about this topic and about you. I'm eager to learn more
Yeah.
about Angular architecture. I'm not very good at architecting things. I always pretend that I am, but I'm not.
Okay, let's see. I think you're quite good. I mean, you have written a book, so you had a lot of research that you had to do.
I didn't touch architecture in the book, thankfully. I would have to suffer a lot because of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. How do we want to start? Should I?
I think I have a bunch of questions, but I think we would be very happy to learn how would you like to present it, like in terms, what are the important things you need to know, and we can move through them.
Yeah, maybe we do it like this. I share one slide where I would say
Let's go.
that's the distilled form that we're always
Nice.
presenting, and I quickly cover it, and then we can go deeper into the topic. You asking questions, also the
Absolutely.
people who are in the chat can also ask questions.
Yeah, I bet we will have a lot of questions today. So yeah, we
That's
can.
great. Let me quickly share the screen. A lot of animations with it. Okay.
Yeah.
So share screen. That's going to be the window. And I think that's the one. Do you see the slides?
Yeah.
Yeah. Wonderful. So this, in a way, this is this distilled form that we bring up very often. You probably have also seen it from some of my colleagues. And I always say this is some kind of a blueprint. And as I said in the beginning, this is where the discussion actually starts, because depending then on the context or how your application is, you can then start to modify it and to adapt it to your own needs. And I also have already some ideas which I can bring in. In the end, what we are seeing here is I would say an extension to this architectural reference model that was introduced already in 2018. You see it on the right bottom by the Enterprise Monorepository Patterns book from NX. And what we did in our case, since we're doing a little bit of domain-driven design, we just gave it a more domain-driven design spin or added some extensions to it. The idea is whenever you know what kind of features you have in your applications, like these verticals. And it is very important with these features that you always say features should be isolated from each other, because this is very important when you want to scale your architecture, when your application scales. You absolutely don't want that everyone talks to each other. You want to have a clear isolation, because you always want to be careful when you change something. You don't want to take the risk that a single line of code just have an impact to all your application. You want to know what's going to change. This is the important thing here. And in our case, in this example, we have already identified. So this process of identifying feature modules, these isolated things, has already been done. And we ended up with booking and boarding. In this case, we call it domains. NX would more or less call it the scopes. But in the end, you have your isolated features.
Yeah, yeah.
And what we're then always saying, I mean, you can of course then create some kind of directory, and then you then just try to squeeze in everything which is booking related into this directory. But again, this is not very scalable. And so what we are always proposing is at least to have these 4 kind of layers. And the first 2 layers, I would say, are very common. Everyone heard already about them. That's the typical split between the smart components versus dumb components, the container versus presentational components, or how it is here, the feature and the UI components. So the idea is that if you have a very large component and you want to split it into different pieces, then you're just saying one part of the component now is in control of kind of the logic. So that one has a lot of TypeScript code, I always say, not so much in terms of templating. And that one knows where to get the data from, how to map the data so that the view model kind of is ready for it. And it also knows what happens when users are doing some events. So when I click on a button or something else. They don't know, though, how the things look like. And that's why we have then our dumb components. They are the experts when it comes to rendering. They show stuff, and they have a lot of code in terms of HTML, template, and also CSS. The way how they get their data is via property binding. So the container component passes it on. The UI component doesn't inject a service because it shouldn't know about anything where this data is coming from.
Yeah.
And when something happens, then the UI component also doesn't know what now should happen. And that's why the UI component just dispatches an event up to the parent component, which is then taking over control and is doing whatever needs to be done. That's the basic idea between these 2 types. And as you can see, there is also a hierarchy. So it should not be the case that the UI component can call a container component. It is always the other way around.
Yeah.
One last thing about UI components, I would even say there exist 2 types, because very often we think UI components are there to be reusable, and it always has to be reusable. And
this is a great point, because I remember there being a very big discussion, and people very often, even very seasoned developers, sometimes think that I don't need to separate this in a way, or because it's just used in this one place, and why would I? It's not reusable. It's a very specific component. But yeah, it makes sense that it doesn't need to be.
Yes, it can also be like that. You say it kind of is a group of one container component, maybe with multiple UI components. They are made exactly for each other. You can't just reuse it somewhere else. And we are just doing this to split this huge component into multiple pieces where each component has its specific role. That's the idea. And then it's not very reusable. It's just made for a very specific use case. And I would still call them UI components. On the other hand, of course, you can have these reusable UI components, but they are then more generic. And to be honest, then they would not find themselves in a domain or in a scope, because they say, look, if, for example, in booking, there is a flight type or something else, sometimes some very booking specific type, these components say, I don't even want to know about this flight type. I'm very generic. If I should show something, then give me a title, give me a description. If it's a flight, if it's a hotel, I don't care, but I give you a way on how to generically show something. And these are then the things that we then find in the shared part. These are then the real reusable UI components.
Yeah. I love this diagram. I wanted to stay up for a while, because I have now a lot of questions. Some of them are questions that I kind of know answers to, and I just want everyone to listen to them. But some of those are questions that I actually couldn't figure out on my own. And maybe, for example, one for me, well, we talked about how a UI component specific to one feature is something like, for example, in the booking section, you maybe have a card that displays a specific info about booking, and that is how it looks. It's not reusable in another feature, so that way it doesn't go into the shared
Yes,
part of the
yes,
application, right? But for example, and when I read something like like utilities, that's also kind of understandable what's going on there.
yeah,
Now,
yeah,
now I feel the most flexible part here is maybe the domain part.
yes, yes. It's also the
So
most discussed one.
what's going on there, and how
Yes.
do I like? Is there a limit where I figure out that okay, this should go into the domain, but this should go into utilities, and this should go into because for example we have utilities specific to features and so on. Yeah.
Yeah. So generally speaking, if it comes to utility functions, then I see them more in shared. As I said, this slide, what
Mhm.
we have here is more like a blueprint. It's more like the way how you should approach things, but it doesn't mean that your architecture will look exactly as it is here. There are some flavors to it. And in the way how I very often write my applications, I don't really see util as something which is part of the domain. Why? Why? Because you see here in terms of the dependency rows, the utils don't have a dependency to the domain. And what we find in the domain are the domain types, are the models.
Ah,
So if I have a function which, for example, says I need to process a flight and I need to be aware of this model flight, then I need to have a dependency to domain. So I need to be upwards. I need to be on top of the
yeah.
domain, and utils are at the bottom, which is why very often I see utils as something of shared. Maybe let me quickly switch to a different slide, which is this one here. And here you see some things are grayed out. In our case, also UI are grayed out.
Yeah.
So this kind of things, we are in a scenario where we only have generic components and not really domain-specific components, which again in
Yeah.
some applications might work, but usually you also have some UI components. But you also see here that the utils is part of the shared.
Ah.
So this is about util. For me, it's very often just in shared, and it happens
Yeah.
very
I
rarely
think
that it ends up in domain.
yeah, this is exactly one question about it. Shouldn't all the shared utils go into the shared part and not individually? So as far as I understand, the general answer to is that like mostly yes.
Mostly yes, yes, yes,
Yeah.
as you see here. And then about the domain,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. So
Yeah.
as Integral just said, they are domain agnostic. Exactly. That's why
Yeah.
they are in shared.
Yeah.
And what we find here in domain, at least in this blueprint version, is that the domain now consists two parts. The first one I've already mentioned, it's the models, so TypeScript interfaces or TypeScript just types. And in this case, and this is where the discussion always starts, we find services which can communicate with the backend. It could also be a state management. It's also very often just called the infrastructure,
Oh,
open
yeah.
API services.
Yeah.
And the discussion here is always, but what if I have now UI components in my domain? They do have access to domain. Can they now also start to communicate with the backend on their own
Oh,
if they have full access to the infrastructure? And in this model that we see here, the answer is no, because there are no UI components in your domain. But if you have them, then it starts to become a little bit more complicated, because you don't want that your UI components now starts to inject services just because it can and do some
yeah.
stuff with the backend. We always want to have the feature or the smart components in control of that.
This is really like a good separation. This is something that often developers I won't say like get wrong because there isn't like a singular wrong or right, but often don't understand the benefit, right?
Yeah, yeah. I
And
mean,
kind of like you could go and say, okay, we need to divide our application this way and structure it this way. And very often, you know how with Angular it's very popular. People build projects where you have a folder that
yes,
says components, a folder that says
yes.
pages, a folder that says services, and so on. And a lot of people are kind of comfortable with that architecture in the sense that, yeah, I feel like I can find which goes where. And I believe that people a bit I would want to hear your opinion. In my opinion, it is people conflating folder structure with the actual application structure because with this approach that we now see on the screen, it's a bit, not even a bit, like a very big bit different
Yeah.
from just structuring folders.
Yeah.
But what
Yeah.
would you say to developers who doubt it and say, well, what's the benefit? Why now we are sitting every day debating if this should go in this feature or that
Mhm.
feature. In my setup, it would just go into a services folder and so on. How do
Yeah.
we convince these people?
Well, I mean, if you have larger applications, your components folder, services folder will be very huge. So you want to see first, when you expand your folder, you want to see the different areas of your application. You don't want to see all the components, but first you want to say, I want to now make the first filter on the feature, which is either booking or boarding. Usually, if you want to change something, you know which part of the application you want to change, and then you want to see this reflected in your folder structure. So when I'm working in the boarding module, then I would expect that somewhere I find a directory, and very soon that I find this directory, which is called boarding. Then you expand the boarding, and then you will see the different kind of technical folders, so to say, where you say this could either be a feature, a UI, or it's just in the domain. And then it's obvious if you then say, okay, the split between container and presentational component has been done always following the rules, then it should be like this. If you want to fix a bug fix in terms of layouting, you don't even need to go into the feature. This is UI related. So you go into the UI folder of boarding. If something is wrong in terms of communication or something in the logic doesn't work, then you go into the feature part. If you know it's now based on something with state management or something of your services, then it depends if you're following this structure or if you add another module type, which I very often just call data, because I very often split domain into two module types where the domain keeps the TypeScript interfaces and where the data contains all the services. And this would then also be the place where I put something like a signal store, state management, or just services where I've decided to manage state on my own. Maybe should I quickly draw the other version in the slides that it's a little bit more easier to understand. So in this case, when it comes here to the dependencies, then what I always say is, let's say we have just one feature. Then on the same level of UI, I would have a data. The domain goes, we have just one. We would then have a very thin one. The util in this case in booking, let's say we don't have really utility functions because they ended up in shared. And what then always happens in terms of the dependency rules is something like this. So I would say UI and data, they have access to the, oh, you don't see it, sorry.
Yeah,
Sorry,
okay.
sorry, really sorry. Yeah, I just did some drawing, but let me quickly reshare the screen. So screen resharing. Yes. You see now it looks a little bit different. You see here data and UI on the same level next to each other. There are some things missing. Let me quickly, yeah, now it's better. They can't communicate with each other. So the services which we have in data, they can only be used by the feature components, which means I'm now very sure if I have the tooling available that checks these rules, that no UI component can start to do its own stuff. It always depends on the feature.
Like what we have in NX.
What we have in NX,
With
yes. Yes. Since data and UI, and of course also feature, need to speak the same language, all three of them need to have access to the domain, because this is where the model, this is where the ubiquitous language is located, and that's why it's at the very bottom. But it's only, as I said, very thin, because we only have types in it and nothing else. All the logic is in data.
And I want to just highlight for a moment, this is a big part where the difference between actually architecturing an app and just having a folder structure comes in, is that, for example, we don't assume anything about where this UI folder is or where the feature folder is, but we know that inside this UI package, let's say, we cannot import anything from feature, right? It goes the other way, and so on. For example, in the domain where we are doing HTTP calls, for example, or business logic related tasks, we cannot have anything from the UI component, for example. We can have
Mhm.
only the UI component can get data from there via the feature, not the other way.
Yes.
And that's
Yes.
kind of what keeps everything sane. And this, I think, is a good moment to highlight for everyone not to confuse, because when people start learning about architecture, this misconception always pops up that, oh, how should I put it here or there? And I know this topic is very popular because we already have a lot of comments. So if you're okay,
Okay.
let's just go through them because there are a
Sure.
bunch of interesting things, I think. So let's assume there's a date picker component which both booking and boarding would need. So this would go into shared. I think I
Yes.
can, yeah, safely say yes. And the other one I think is mildly spicy because it mentions domains and subdomains.
Yeah, I mean, usually we call these things the subdomains. The domain is the complete enterprise, or more or less. But in the end, yeah, I mean, booking and boarding, they are separated modules. You can also say feature modules. It really depends which kind of approach you are using. If you say you're using domain-driven design in order to reach isolated modules, then we're using more the language of
Yeah.
domain-driven design. If you say, no, I don't need it, I know already what kind of feature modules I require so that they're isolated. You can also say scope or something else. In the end, what really counts is that these modules, that these subdomains are isolated, and that within them you have this kind of structure for module types, because feature,
Yeah.
data, UI, domain are different types of modules.
Yeah, that makes sense. And to Thomas here, I want to share a personal, maybe not personal, professional story. So you know how you with the Angular, when you generate components, you already get a very tiny version of this where you have your UI level, which is the HTML file, and your logic level. They are placed together, usually in one folder, right? It's a very small scale, but the same thing,
Yeah.
essentially. So usually the logic is what we edit together, we put together. I have been reviewing like 2 or 3 years ago an application, a big application, which someone maybe wanted us to work on or something. You know what they did? And I don't have anything to say. I actually applaud them for their commitment to this bit because they created folder called views and they put all the component HTML files, only HTML files there.
Okay.
And they created a folder from the TypeScript files
Oh,
and put
oh.
everything in the TypeScript folder.
Yeah.
And the CSS and everything else went somewhere else. And it was sometimes you gotta fight the framework, right? In maybe,
Yeah.
but this was actual war against Angular.
Yeah. Yeah. This
So
is.
maybe that moment I missed the pages folder. That would at least make more sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
Missed first part looks like feature-based vertical slice architecture. Probably could be good with tabs and tags with NX. Yes, we already touched a bit about NX.
Yeah,
I
we
bet
touched
we will.
upon it. Yeah. So this is then about the tooling, which helps you to automatically verify that these rules are all kept in place. But first, you need to have some idea how it should look
Yeah,
like.
yeah, right. And this is how I set up my React project with features directory and then component services use directories instead. You know what? If I am capable, I want to ask a question back. I've never worked on a really serious React project. What do React people think when they say services? This
Yeah.
this isn't a joke question. Yeah, I'm interested how people implement that sort of stuff in React. Maybe you feel free to answer in the comments if you are still listening. Oh man, we have a lot of questions. Can we please see it in an IDE actually or in a GitHub
Sure.
as an example?
Sure.
Yeah, if you have that capability, that would be nice.
You sure? Let me quickly. We are doing the NX version first, and then if we have time, we can also do the sheriff part, which in the end is about the same application, but just with a different structure. Let me quickly find the shortcuts. Lab 500 Enterprise Starter. And I'm going to share my IntelliJ. Oh, there we are. That's our flight app. And as you see here, we have here this classic
Oh, so
monorepository approach from
still
NX.
not visible, I think.
Let's wait.
Ah,
Yeah,
yeah, now it's
now
there.
it's
Yeah,
there.
yeah,
Now it's there. Now it's there. So you have here, for example, the tickets and the check-in. These are separate applications, so to say. They are the app shell, which we haven't seen before in the slides, but in
yeah,
the end, it's just the app component with a bunch of core services, I would say, maybe the header, the footer, the side menu, and just the placeholder where you then really start loading in the features. The, sorry, I always mix up terms very often. Yeah.
yeah,
And then we have here libs. And you see here that each module that we have seen before in the slides, like the feature, UI, data, whatever, they are now categorized in along their domains. So we have here in this case tickets, check-in. It's not boarding or booking. Now it's just tickets and check-in. And we also have here shared. And this is just a folder, nothing else yet, because the actual code is lying then in the modules themselves in the subfolder. So if I go here to
oh,
tickets, then you see that here we have all the code. So here we have, for example, this domain, which
yeah,
is the first version where we only have a file interface. And
yeah,
then there is this infrastructure where we would also have those services. Where I said before, you can also say a domain, and then you can also move those kind of services into data so that UI can't access it. In our case, though, it's not necessary because we don't have here any UI modules. It's just feature modules. And
yeah,
this is why we can put everything together in the domain and don't have to come up with 4 different module types. The UI and the utils are all part of shared. And as you see here, they are also just simple NX libraries in that sense,
yeah.
with all the boilerplate code which a library requires in NX. But in the end, this is how it would look like in a real project.
Essentially, we treat every feature, every utility, let's say, let's call it component, not Angular component, but like a piece of code, and every UI part as a small scale app that can kind of
Yes,
live itself and has some rules about who can use it and which other libraries it can import and use.
exactly. And maybe I quickly jump into the way how these rules are applied, or do we want to continue with the questions, Armen?
Oh, we have a lot of questions. I think some of
Okay.
them. Oh, you know what? This is one that is good. Data pickers are happy perfect examples to show two features needing the same component. That's true. What if booking and boarding blur together somehow in another feature that needs stuff from both of them?
Yes, yes,
Yeah,
yes,
that's
yes.
maybe the question.
Yes. So generally speaking, we always say feature modules should be isolated from each other. But I would more say that we should strive for it. That's a tendency that we want to achieve, but we also have to be realistic. Very often it just doesn't work. So very often
Uh,
we need to access something from another domain. And in that case, of course, it always becomes more complicated if you add these things. But in that case, we would then add a so-called API module on top of the feature module, which has access to everything of the inside of the domain. And this API module, given the dependency rules are set correctly, would be exposed. You can also say it's not exposed to all the other domains, but maybe just to boarding. If I'm
yeah,
booking, I can only provide data to boarding. And well, then it just exports those things which it thinks are usable for the other domain. In most cases, it's about data. So in those applications that I see, I as a boarding, if I want to access booking data, then I probably don't want to use a UI component from booking.
huh,
I want to have the booking data because I have my own UI components how
yeah,
to show things. So usually we are exposing things like services, which are then returning
yeah,
some kind of data. But again, that requires an own module type, which would then be called the API, and
yeah.
it doesn't make things easier in terms of configuring all the dependency rules.
That's a good explanation, and it kind of shed a bit of light on that topic for me too. But then it also kind of created a new question for me now about
Mhm.
the data itself, right? So I will give you a real world example from a project that I used to work on, and
Mhm.
maybe sometimes still do. So It's like a big HR related project.
Mhm.
So you have a company, you have actually a bunch of companies, and you have an admin layer
Yes.
which can have, essentially we can call it like a super admin layer, which can create other companies where people can create
Mhm.
users and do a bunch of stuff. So you have, for example, this separate place where you can view lists of users, right?
Mhm.
But users are actually kind of that piece of data that goes everywhere. If I go
Yes.
to the projects, for example, module, there I can see people that work on projects. If I
Mhm.
go to the module that handles administrative stuff or holidays or anything, everything goes around the users.
Yes.
So do these other modules import, for example, the user type or the user service? Does the user service simply go into the shared folder? And in that way, doesn't that kind of blur that line that we were talking about?
I know. I know.
Yeah.
So generally speaking, it always you're adding more complexity the larger the application grows. In the very beginning, I would say you have a user service. The user is known to everyone because it is just shared. Then, what could happen is that you are saying your domains, they have not probably not always the same type of user.
Yeah.
So, for example, I can give you another
Oh,
example which I've been working on. It was a website where we provided three services: subscriptions, an online shop, and management you or managing end users as employees. So in our case, it was always user. We always said this is the user. But for the three domains, we used for the content part, it was not the user, it was the subscriber with different information than what we found in the online shop, where it was not the subscriber, but where it was our customer. And
oh,
in the other one, where it was about managing people, it was, for example, an employee. In the end, all came from the same user, but we only required parts of that big user object which we had. So what we had to do at the end is that there was something which we call anti-corruption layer in domain-driven design, which means when one domain accesses the user, and let's say this is now the shop domain where the user is actually called consumer, and we only need,
oh,
I don't know, the address, but not really his subscription status or social security number or something. Then this anti-corruption layer will say, I'm going to fetch you from that particular service, the data or whatever from the shared, and I'm going to map it exactly to this consumer type which the domain model consumer, how it is defined in the domain itself.
oh,
And it could happen that we are using even different properties because that's just the domain language, how people talk about a consumer. It
yeah,
could be that, for example, in one case, it's called first name and last name. In the other one, it's called surname or just full name or something
yeah.
else.
Okay.
And we are really trying with these domains to use exactly those kind of models, how they are used, very specific for the domains. And if we're receiving that from a very generic service, then there is one on the very top, a mapper function available, which is called the anti-corruption layer, and that one is doing then the mapping. So that inside of the domain, whenever I'm dealing with this kind of consumer type, I don't have to think about the generic type. For me, it's just the customer and nothing else. Requires, of course, again, much more boilerplate code, but in the end, it pays off if your online shop is huge and you see this consumer everywhere.
So essentially, let me just rewind a bit back.
Yes,
So essentially, it's not more of a code situation, but more of a mindset situation. We, in the end, it could be, and even could be like likely that the subscriber object, for example, in the subscriptions module, would be actually the same that the user module, for example, in the admin domain or whatever. It could be the same data with the same field and the same properties.
yeah,
But we call it a different name, and we sort of have this, as you say, the anti-corruption layer that
mm,
makes sure that in this part of the application, this piece of data is used only in this particular way. So
yes.
it cannot, so a subscriber domain cannot change the user's name, for example, and affect something that the admin sees in the kind of way. it only deals with those parts of the user
Yes,
or
yes,
yes
yes, yes.
object
I mean,
that
of course,
makes
if the
sense. Yeah.
if the online shop gives me the option to rename myself, then of
Yeah.
course it has an impact to everyone.
Yeah.
But if the online shop says, "Look, I want to have another delivery address," what does the subscription thing care about, or the other one?
Yeah. Yeah.
That's none of their business, and they even don't know about that stuff.
So essentially, each domain has to figure out what it does and what it can do and cannot do,
Yes.
and then you kind of bind them in the way that everyone has its place but cannot kind of overstep it and spill its stuff into the other domains.
Yes, yes. And you're also making this extra effort of having domain-specific models. So you don't make any compromise where I say, well, it's the user, they are calling it last name, but everyone in this domain talks about
Yeah,
the surname. Let's just go with the last name. You don't do this. You say, no, it's the surname. That's the domain model, how it is used inside of this
yeah.
domain. I need to map it. Full stop.
And I think two very practical questions we have here, which one is that can this be done with just simple folders and files and not like full-blown libraries?
That wouldn't then
I
be
think it
the
could
answer.
be, yeah.
In this case, would be the sheriff, yes, which
Yeah, but yeah,
afterwards.
if you are willing to go every day, especially in a big team, and say who committed this file in this folder and imported this library into this other feature library, then yeah, you could do it. But yeah, I guess the tools that NX has, the scoped libraries, right? We call them, where you can disallow importing certain things. You can put scopes on, and this is the NX example. Of course, there are other tools, obviously, that could be used, but NX is very
Yeah,
popular in Angular ecosystem. Yeah, you have these all things that can help you separate this. And the other question, maybe also practical from the same person, with all that library boilerplate, how to keep package versions dependencies up to date. I guess
yeah.
it's more of an NX question in general.
It is, it is. So generally speaking, we have to say the way how it works in NX, if we want to have these dependency rules in place, then NX works on the level of a library. So that's the unit for a module. In NX, you can also say it's a module. I don't even use it like a library, which I want to publish to a registry. It's just a module, but NX requires it to be in a library. And that's why, yeah, they are not really publishable or something like this. So you don't really have to deal with the package version or that stuff. It's
Yeah,
just in
yeah.
the end like normal code for you, and you just treat it as a module. But NX requires it to be also a library. That's the reason.
Can I ask a hot take question?
Yes, sure.
Would you say the library name is not very successful name for it? Because I think it kind of confuses people. People think library, oh, okay, reusable stuff that lives somewhere, and they don't think, oh, this is actually my active feature that I am developing is a library.
From a technical level, yeah, I mean the term is ambiguous because it could mean many things at
Yeah.
once. Yeah, maybe if we just say module, but in the end, they generate
That
these
will be
animations.
confused with ng modules, or
Oh,
maybe like
yeah. Oh
yeah,
God, yes, of course. We
you
don't
could
want
say
to get into
package
that.
or something, maybe.
Yeah,
Well,
or
I
maybe
mean,
we just
it's not gonna change anything, yeah.
or maybe we just forget that engine modules ever existed and we're only using the
I
term module.
successfully did, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah. I think there's I don't I cannot highlight more questions because I think there's a big discussion going on without us in the comments, which is very
Ah,
commendable, an interesting discussion, but a quite long one. But there is a question about shared user state, for example. One question
mhm.
regarding shared user state, you mean that you injected auth service in app initializer instead of just using term subscription? Maybe this wasn't aimed at us actually.
Yeah, it looks like that, like the former
Maybe,
context is.
yeah. But the formal context is quite large. Yeah, I think they're full blown discussing how to architect an app.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think we don't have much questions right now, and we can kind of move on. Maybe talk about domain-driven design, right? We already kind of touched on that.
We touched on it already. Yes, yes.
Yeah.
So the core of domain-driven design, the way how I see it, is that it really should help us to find out those kind of isolated modules. especially in a context where things are extremely complicated, where maybe insurance, banks, or just some stuff where you as a developer don't really understand what's going on, but you do now have the task to come up with modules. And in this case, what you're doing is that you say you don't even try to make features based on technical things that will
Uh-huh.
not work, will not be isolated. What you're doing instead is that you're going to your users, to your end users, and you listen, first of all, the way how they speak about their work. And what you will find out is that there are different groups of users. And within a group, you will realize that they're all using the same terms and always have the same understanding. And the nice thing now is that within these groups, there is a lot of communication going on. Whereas between those groups, where we are switching to another subdomain, the communication is not that high. And the idea now is that we are using these kind of groups that we say, well, this is exactly what we want to have a module, that inside of a module, the communication relationships are very high, but to the outside, to other modules, it's not like this. And this, in the end, is then one of these things that the way how we use it for the front end, where you could then say, okay, I'm now modeling my features or my verticals after those subdomains. Because it's very likely that these users who are working in one subdomain will not work in another one because it's a different department. They're speaking a different language. It's not their job, so to say. That's one of these ideas, to get to these kind of isolated things.
So it's kind of as much as I imagine it, to be honest, I've never worked in a team that actually used and implemented in any way domain-driven design.
Mhm.
Or maybe they wish they did that or something like that. So as far as I understand, it's more of like trying to fight against this developer's first instinct to go and say, oh, I need to create components, I need to create services, I need to create something. And instead, like think in terms of what entities exist in this business domain that is trying to solve a problem. And when I say entity, I don't mean like the software term entity, but
Yeah,
rather like
yeah.
how it works and what are the relations, right, between them and so on.
It's really about helping you finding those isolated modules in an
Yeah,
environment where you have no idea what's going on.
yeah,
Very complicated stuff, so to say.
yeah.
Just think of an insurance. There are so many rules, so many laws.
I
You as a
try not.
developer, you don't have any idea what's going on, but you need to come up with an application that supports
Yeah,
it.
yeah,
That's why you
that
need to
makes
go to
sense.
your end users, and they need to help you.
Yeah. So I would say that from what I've heard, like online or read
Yeah,
about domain-driven design, it has this a bit of a cultish following in terms of there are always strong opinions flying around what is domain-driven design. I've heard something like that you
yeah,
cannot do DDD only on the front end, you have to do it on the scope of the whole team or the whole, I
mm,
don't know. And again, as not an expert on DDD at all,
yeah.
for me, it all seems like a quite complicated topic. So, what would be a
It
good
is.
way to like, yeah, get into it and not
Mhm.
be kind of intimidated with all the concepts that fly
Yeah,
around?
yeah, yeah. So in the end, I mean, there are many things. There are people who say domain-driven design is not necessary for the front end, where I would say, well, maybe we are not talking about the same domain-driven design. It's more about taking ideas of domain-driven design and trying to find places how it fits into the front end. The other thing is that we can't use domain-driven design. It's not really true because I used it in the past without even knowing it. So there are some
Yeah,
things where you need it. In the end, I think it's very often the question of how large, how complicated your application is. If it's very small, and if you see the features right in front of you, maybe you have an application, you look at the side menu, to say menu one, menu two, menu three, they are completely isolated. You don't need domain-driven design for that. You have already your verticals. You don't even have to think about them.
yeah,
But if things are becoming larger, and isolation of modules again is an important thing, and it's not just you, it's not just your team. There are multiple teams working on it in different departments. You don't even know all of them.
mm,
Then these things, then they are becoming important. So it's not like you should use domain-driven design at each size. It's more like an enterprise problem.
Yeah.
And on these levels, it really shines. Of course, if you are just 4 people and you're writing one application only, you don't want to do all that stuff like event storming, bounded context, and all of that.
Yeah.
It is not necessary. Why do you want to do it? It's like it's a overkill. But if it becomes larger, then you are desperately looking for things which can help you to structure the code. And in this case, domain-driven design really helps a lot.
Yeah.
I can give you one example because I said I experienced it without knowing it very quickly. I used to work, I always tell the story, I used to work at a chocolate company. And there was shift. So one shift ended, the next one came in. And when a new shift began, they needed to know what happened in the former shift, obviously. So there was something which was an incident report, and with each incident that happened, they need to assign the incident to something which we call the organizational unit. So the place where something has happened.
Yeah.
So, and everyone was clear how the organization, how the structure of the organization looked like. Then another department also had shifts. This was the maintenance department and not the operations department. They also wanted to use this application, but for some reason, they were really angry because they said, what you have as an organizational unit, this is completely wrong. The organization doesn't look like this. The factory looks completely different. There are machines. Each machine has a certain name, and this is how it works. The other group had a completely different perspective. And the mistake that I did, and I probably wouldn't have done it if I would have known about domain-driven design, because this is the sign that you are trying to merge multiple subdomains together. You're trying to mixing them. That's not going to end well. For me, I just created one organizational unit which served all needs. Then I had this kind of God class where I knew whenever I change something in it, it will affect the complete code base, and I have everything else than just isolated code, isolated modules. So in the end, the better idea would have been, and I also then did this at the end, to split it apart, because this maintenance department never talked to the operations department. Everyone was using their structure, which they fell in love with. Everyone was happy. Everyone found themselves in that place. And this is one example, a very small example, but still an example that proves that domain-driven design is actually very helpful in the front end.
So, actually, great story. Now it kind of makes sense in terms of you get out, completely toss away all the technical concepts, doesn't matter. And it's more like in real life, it works like this. I remember a similar situation when we were working on a logistics provider application. It wasn't even an application because it was essentially a platform. And a part of it was like financial management. A part of it was about following like voyages, and the part of it was following the drivers, right? Who would pick up stuff at the ports, and there were many different layers, many different domains, right? And they never actually kind of really talk to each other, as you have mentioned, because drivers in one port in this part of the world have no idea about what happens in the depot of some other port on the other end of the world. They only care about them seeing their schedules and whatnot, and what packages they need to pick up and deliver where, and so on. So I think this kind of clarifies, because I wouldn't say we did very bad on that architecture. It was really all right. But probably if we were doing domain-driven design with it, we would we wouldn't do so much refactoring, I guess, because it was very, very clearly defined. It wasn't. It was actually an older app already existed that kind of showed how it worked. We were kind of building a new one on top of that. And if I really was, if I had this explanation, I would say that maybe we would not have to come back and say, oh, you know what, we did it wrong. We don't need a voyage object in all these different applications, because each one, the voyage that the driver is aware of is kind of a different thing. For him, the voyage is just a package that he gets. Yeah, and
Exactly. I mean, in the slides that we are using, we are not using the organizational unit, but we're using the term flight, where we say,
yeah,
look, it is perfectly fine if this term flight exists multiple times, given that it's only available one time per domain. That's perfectly fine. It's called flight. The people also call it flight, but you will also see if they are talking with each other, there is a misunderstanding, because what the flight means for one person of that domain is a complete different meaning for the other one. But since they never really cross that much, it's just fine. And you don't try to create one big flight object which fulfills all domains. This is not what you do.
yeah.
And one last thing, because you also asked another question about domain-driven design should be done on the backend. Yes, of course.
Yeah, we have actually a question right about that. I think it is perfect for the front end because so close to users that there's a real benefit and so on. Yeah. Now
Yeah.
let's reconstruct this.
Yeah. So generally speaking, the backend is benefiting much more of domain-driven design. They also usually do it, and you are very happy if that just fits exactly the front end. Especially
Yeah.
if front end and backend are designed as one idea, as a whole, then usually you can very easily just reuse all that stuff which the backend provides. But it can also happen that, for example, the backend does not use domain-driven design, very rarely, but once I encountered a backend which was just a thin layer to the database. So all the REST
No.
endpoints were just the database tables, and these are not domains. Then
Yeah.
again, you have to do the mapping in the front end. Another idea or another situation, and I've never experienced this, but Manfred told me, about human resources, salary management, or when you pay the salary to your employees, that the logic, the business logic for that is extremely complicated. There are a lot of things going on under the hood in the backend, because this is where usually we find the business logic. And you didn't want to take this complicated stuff into the front end, because the front end was just a slice of the complete complexity. So what they were doing is that they created their own domain model, a much, much more simpler domain than it was in the backend, because again, they didn't want to overcomplicate things in the front end, like having things which they don't even need. This also does exist. This also exists.
Yeah. I think also maybe on the backend part, domain driven could be good in terms of maybe helping to understand where certain bottlenecks are.
Yeah.
And in the front end, you probably don't have that issue. The only bottleneck that you have is that your browser is capable of doing only 6 uh, simultaneous HTTP requests, and then
Yes.
they
Yeah.
cure the rest of it. And this is a very fairly simple bottleneck. We don't, and other than that, we can't do much. So yeah,
Yeah.
but in the front end, I guess the biggest benefit is that you get a very good organization of your project, and yeah.
Yes.
And I have to ask, maybe it would make sense as experienced developers, we know that usually we answer questions by saying it depends, right? So we see a lot of upsides to doing architecture in certain ways and so on. And we kind of touched a bit on the downsides that, okay, we have a bit more boilerplate and maybe some
Mhm.
files here and there. I wouldn't call that a very big downside. I'm just saying my opinion. I like boilerplate. Okay. I
Mhm.
like writing NGRX reducers.
Yes, I just wanted to mention
Honestly,
it.
I
Yes.
love it. Yeah. I like it because it makes it easy for me to find where something is working. If I see that the data isn't changing in a way that I want it to change, I know which reducer function I want to
Mhm.
like
Mhm.
see, and it goes through this official channel of dispatching stuff and so on, right? I like boilerplate. Boilerplate
Yeah.
if it's not like completely. Sometimes people invent abstractions and so on, but these are like battle tested abstractions that we know that they are all right. Other than
Mhm.
those, what would you say are kind of downsides, or maybe just some pain points that you would want developers to know? Oh, you will run into this if you start doing architecture this way.
You mean now if you really try to apply domain-driven design, or if you don't do it?
No, if you try to, yeah, if you try,
Yeah.
these are the issues, these are the things that you like now that you need to let go, stuff like that. or this may be
I would say
problem in my
boilerplate code,
product.
and maybe you don't get it right the first time. Then you need to prepare for a refactoring, obviously, which again means removing boilerplate code, adding new boilerplate code. But I can assure you, once you have it, you have a scalable system, and that really pays off in the long run. So,
I know it absolutely does. It's sometimes difficult to explain, like, sorry for using corporate word, but to all the stakeholders. Sometimes you want to post
mhm,
something, especially I've worked a lot of on outsourced projects where we have this
mhm,
company come in and ask for features, ask for
yeah,
analysis on something. Yeah.
yes,
And
yes, that's right.
usually, oh, these are the problems you have. Let's fix it this way and that way. And they were like, I don't care about those problems. I don't care about the structure, whatever. I want this and that. And on the other hand, you think, oh, okay, I finally convinced our client to let us do this or do that. And then you go to your team and say, let's start. Let's learn a bit about NX.
Mhm,
Let's learn about it. And everyone is going like, why
mhm.
do we need it? You know, we have 5 features we need to implement. We don't care about this and that.
Okay, I see what you mean. Maybe you don't have to throw in everything at once. Maybe if you start, you just care in the first run or in the first period of time that you say you have at least feature, let's just say directories. We don't even now talk about an X, but let's just say you really care that the code which belongs to a certain feature is located in that feature. And you don't need to come up with presentational components, container components, data, whatever. If your application grows, and you also see this from your colleagues, they will start to complain, things stop, everything, something needs to happen. You usually have a good feeling about this. Then you always know what comes next. The next thing then would be inside of the features, you split it up into smart container components, maybe data services and models. And if the application then still starts to grow, then you can add subdomains on top of it, like using multiple features, putting them into a subdomain. And that one should then scale quite a lot. And if that also doesn't work anymore, and you have so many people,
Yeah.
then of course you need to think about other things, for example, like microfrontends or that stuff.
No,
But always not always doing the extreme, but knowing the path. What would be the next step be for the next scaling unit, so to say, and not working against it.
that's
This is what I always do.
yeah. I like that response. It's very political in a good way because in situations like this, you need to think about the politics side of things too in the office. This reminds me of the discussion on our second episode with Jerome about updates, how you need to
Mhm.
go and convince people that please
Yeah, of
let me
course.
upgrade the Angular version. Yeah, it's kind of a bit the same, but this one is even more important because being like one version behind on Angular usually isn't a big deal, but your entire application architecture is very, very important thing. And you
Yeah,
said the word, yeah,
it's more like a social skill. I mean,
yeah,
it's very hard to enforce your whole will on everyone, but everyone is in a way ready to make a compromise. So you can
yeah.
say, look, we don't do domain-driven design,
If
but
it's a reasonable team.
yeah, I mean, usually if you give someone else what they want, then they will
Yeah,
usually take it. So you can say, look, we don't do this whole thing, domain-driven design. If they hate domain-driven design for some reason, you just call it scope. As I said, in the end, it's important that you have these isolated features, and you say, let's just group the structure of your folders or your architecture per feature, and then let's see how it
yeah.
works. That's
And
a
we
start.
have a question when you will decide NX is the way to go.
Yeah, so
I
from
think
my
this
yeah, sorry.
I think this question is related to us, not that discussion in the comments. Uh, I think it's a more broad question
Yeah, I
in terms
mean,
of
what I always say is there are certain applications where I would say you don't need an X. There are certain applications where I would say you might benefit from an X, and then there are certain applications where I say you absolutely need an X. I would say the smaller the applications are, especially if you're in a starting phase and you might be overwhelmed, then maybe start with the Angular CLI. Just
yeah,
just start with it. You can always go to NX if you want, so that's not a stopper or something.
Yeah.
The sooner that you are saying, okay, now I want to come up with module boundaries, yeah, you can go with NX, but again, we also have, for example, the Sheriff tool, which when the question is only about module boundaries, you can also use the Sheriff. I would go with NX definitely if I would say I have libraries which I want to expose, publish. I have a need for a build cache, so when performance in terms of building becomes
Yeah.
important. And when I would say, okay, absolutely, monorepositories. So if you have multiple
Yeah.
applications in in a repository and you need to manage it, then you need these tools which NX gives you. For example, the visualization graph, the affected features of all
Yeah.
the tasks which they have, and that stuff. This is my typical answer, which I give.
Yeah, that makes sense. Maybe a small continuation of that question from me would be, what other tools than NX? We know that NX is not the only monorepo management. Is it the best one in terms of Angular, in your opinion?
To be honest, I didn't try the other one, like TurboRepo and
Yeah.
Lerna, which also belongs to NX in a way. There is also WireUp, as far as I know, but it's
I
more a
haven't heard about that
subset
one.
of NX. And I mean, if we're talking about the Angular scope, we have to say in Angular, the majority is either Angular CLI, NX, which means you have a lot of blog articles, you have a lot of videos, you have a lot of people who have some experience with it. So in this case, I would
Yeah.
play it safe and either Angular CLI or NX.
Yeah, that makes sense. For me, I have no problem actually saying that Annex maybe could be the best tool for that because it's so supportive of everything that Angular does, right? There is a bit of a tight coupling here
Yes,
between,
yes.
yeah, and it makes sense to go for NX. It's really great. I have quite some experience with NX too. Absolutely liked it. Yeah, you get used to the boilerplate files. It's all right. I think there was something that allowed you to kind of hide them or whatever. I don't care.
Um,
I never did, but just
I mean, Project
remember that.
Crystal, where what Eunice did, like you can configure certain things where then NX sees something as a library, a directory
Yeah.
or so, where you can use the API, or this is this
No.
Project Crystal, which they brought in. I think this is what you mean.
Yeah.
It exists, yes, yes, but we don't see it that often. Does NX make sense in multi-rep or native federation, or does it make sense only in monorepo situation? NX also, I mean, the first generation of NX, which started being more like tooling for monorepository, where I would have said yes, but nowadays, or very not nowadays, for many years already, NX is also known to add a lot of tooling,
Yeah.
which the Angular CLI doesn't have. And if you don't have the time to install and maintain these tools on your own, and you have just one application, then you can also use NX for that. NX has a standalone mode where you just have one application and that's
Yeah.
it. But you get all the benefits of all the tooling and the configuration.
Absolutely. And
But
you must also,
that is, sorry, the question also had something with native federation, which is
yeah,
more
the
about
previous one,
microcontents.
yeah, this one, native federation. You should take it. I
A
have no
native
idea about native
native
federation.
federation is
No.
coming is from us. So this is this approach where you use ES build to create
Right.
microfrontends.
Yeah.
In the end,
Oh, the
yes,
bad
if you
word,
have an
microfrontend. Maybe let's talk about them for a change.
yes,
Would
yes.
you actually, I have one question about, not exactly about micro frontends, but more like,
Yes.
if you were to do micro frontends,
Mhm.
would that in any way affect the way you architect your application? If you know it's gonna work,
I mean, it would be the
or
most
the wisdom here is actually that it doesn't matter what you are doing in terms of how is it going to be presented to the user.
in terms of architecture, if you do micro frontends, there are a few things. First of all, you are much better off if you are managing that all the micro frontends in a way have the same versions. This is an Angular specific things, and you would really benefit a lot from it. Maybe we don't have time to go into the details, but let me just believe me, it's better if you're all running on the same versions. The next thing is what we very often see is that people, if they have micro frontends, then they always try to come up with certain communication questions. How can micro frontends communicate with each other? And they try to invest in that quite a lot, which is not what you should, because you're going with micro frontends because you want to have a complete separation of these things. And if you're saying, how can we bring them together? You're working against the initial intention of micro frontends. So be very careful about it. Communication is, of course, important. There are certain things, but keep it very low level. Don't overdo things. Sometimes like a broker service or something where a message bus is enough, and that's it. This is what I would say. In addition, with micro frontend architectures, you should always plan for a special team which is maintaining especially the shell which hosts the micro frontends, which knows about details, technical details, which goes well, which doesn't work very well in micro frontends, and they also need to be supportive to the actual application teams which are developing their own micro frontends. You need a very specialized teams with a lot of technical knowledge to make micro frontends a real success. And of course, if you apply domain-driven design, you have this full isolation, which will also help you in micro frontends, because you definitely don't want to merge micro frontends together once you have them. It's the same as it is in microservices. They're all running on, they're completely isolated, and you want to get that right. So if you don't have the right architecture, don't even try to reach out to micro frontends. It will bite you back. Armen, I don't hear you. Sorry.
Muted myself. This is the first time. I think starting from the very first episode, I was thinking that, I should be careful not to mute myself and then start talking. And this is the first time I slipped, actually.
Did you say something before? Maybe I didn't hear it.
No, I was saying, I was reading the comment, which says, and you must also be aware that additional tools like NX come with their own hurdles. Yeah, of course.
Of course. It's an additional layer. Updating might probably not go that smoothly as it is with Angular CLI. But as I said, if you don't have that much pressure, give it a try with the Angular CLI, and you can always go to NX if you want. And there are some situations where I would really recommend it.
That is really the kind of point of the whole thing. And I love to keep stuff simple. I don't like installing dependencies, to be honest, especially for simple things. But architecture, that's probably the biggest question we are essentially solving every day, because the app changes every day. People commit new code, create new features, and having a solid architecture is the most important thing. It doesn't matter if you're using signals or not if you cannot find where you are going to put them.
Signals will make it easier, I guess, but just code in general, not really about architecture, of course.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I think I cannot conjure up more questions. I learned myself a lot about architecture today.
Nice.
I think the big discussion in the comments continues. If I take a look at it, I will see that. Wow, these are really long comments.
I didn't have the time to read them, but
no, I tried to several times, but there are a lot of comments. There was a very big discussion, and I think the final one kind of sheds a bit of light on what was being talked here, which I found interesting. I use a tool to auto-generate front-end models from back-end models to keep them in sync. Then I have some front-end specific models. I start my projects with front-end designs, create endpoints, database schema. I'm not sure if this is domain-driven or data-driven.
Me neither, because the question is, how do you structure your modules? Do you
but keep in mind this is probably not directed at us, but I just kind of cherry-picked one comment. But I guess from what I learned from you today, Rainer, I think the answer is that you can't actually answer if it's domain driven or not if you don't know the practices of how they come up with the separation and isolation of all these data pieces. You could, for what I understand in this very specific example, you could come together with your team, understand the domains and their boundaries and their everything, figure out, then the backend would create some models, and then you would use a tool to get that stuff brought over to your front end, and it will still be domain driven. Or on the other hand, the backend could be completely separate from you. You don't know what's going on there. You just kind of carry over the models from there and use it. I'm actually just saying that to understand if I actually learned something today. I need you to confirm if I'm correct.
Domain-driven design is a methodology. It's not like
Yeah.
a technical thing.
Yeah.
So again, it always depends on how you perceive those kind of modules and these models. If you say, I don't really care, I don't even talk to my users, then it's probably not that much domain-driven design. But if you do, yeah. And in the end, what this person said, that it looks like they are he's mapping the backend models to the front-end models, so there might be some kind of difference which happens, but I hope that they are very similar. So not that you have a huge mapping logic inside it, because nothing really matches. They should be similar in most cases.
So yeah, therefore, would be a good wrap up to say that to this domain-driven design topic, that this is actually a process and a method of achieving something rather than a technical thing that you write in your code.
Yes.
Probably from the code, people can't figure out if you actually did.
Yes. From the front-end perspective, it's the methodology. In the backend, it might be different because a lot of patterns are also around when it comes to domain-driven design. And also in the backend, you have the business logic, which we don't have that in the front end. So we're trying only to take those parts from the whole domain-driven design thing, trying to apply it to the front end. And in most cases, it's really about kind of applying that methodology to come up with these verticals and that stuff. It's not really like this technical thing where you say you have a certain interface or you have a certain type which needs to be there because it's domain-driven design. That's not the way how it is.
Yeah, makes sense. And probably the final question from me would be, any great resources to suggest?
Yes,
on the top of your head. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we have our website. Manfred is blogging about quite a lot there. I also gave talks in the past, evolving architecture. I think there are some on YouTube. You find these talks recorded. One is from NG Asia, and the other one was at the Angular Meetup in Toronto. There are a lot of books about, if it's really about domain-driven design. You can also read the ones for the backend to get the broader picture. I would heavily recommend to read this NX book, the Enterprise Monorepository Pattern. It's really good because it's actually made for Angular applications. And yeah, of course, we also have certain ebooks which also go into detail. So a lot of information is available for free. Just take it, and you need to have, of course, the time to read all that stuff.
Nice. I bet a lot of people are right now, if they haven't heard about those books and resources, are gonna look that up. That's great. I haven't. I know the last one you mentioned for NX. I always wanted to read that, but I got caught up on a bunch of LLM stuff. Now everyone wants to do LLMs with me. Yeah. So, sorry everyone. But at some point I'm gonna give it a read, definitely.
Yeah.
So yeah, it seems that everyone enjoyed it today. Lots of great comments. Thanks everyone for joining. It was really insightful discussion. I myself learned a bunch of stuff. I have never done domain-driven design, so it was a kind of a more hands-on lesson for me too. So yeah, I mean, this topic is so big, right? There's always stuff to discuss. There are always debates about everything.
Yes. And don't get too picky on terms. I think this is my last recommendation.
Yeah,
Maybe before you start the struggle, before you start, if this is this term or if it is that term, just talk to each other. Try if you're actually meaning the same thing. Just because you're using the same terms doesn't mean that you have the same
yeah,
definition of it. So
yeah.
this always, most of the times, just clears things on its own.
That makes sense. That makes sense. Absolutely. Oh, so yeah. Thank you, Rainer, very much.
Thanks,
This
Armen,
was
for putting
absolutely
this
great.
together. Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot for being here.
Please come back, and everyone, thanks for joining. Hope you enjoyed it and found it really useful. So yeah, see everyone on the next one. Bye.
Bye.